This podcast is on analyzing the social science literature for the purposes of writing a research report. The idea for this particular module is to be able to identify relevant research articles to the topic that you're interested in. We also want to be able to explain how these articles are structured. There's a certain formula and style to an academic article. We also want to be able to summarize and synthesize academic articles on a specific topic. We'll have a couple of examples of this. And finally, we'd like to be able to cite or use a citation style rather like that of the APSA or the American Political Science Association. As a brief review of previous podcasts, so far we have identified what are called dependent variables and independent variables. Let's recall that a dependent variable is something that we're interested in studying. It's an outcome of some sort, or a behavior in politics that we wish to explain. We would like to be able to explain why there are variations in our dependent variable. And we would like to make this explanation based upon changes in an independent variable of interest. The independent variable should be connected in some way to the dependent variable, theoretically speaking, and in terms of creating a hypothesis. So for example, a dependent variable in the political science literature is the level of democracy. We can assume that some countries are very democratic, some countries are semi-democratic, that is, they're missing elements that are deemed critical for a democracy, and there are still other countries that are not democratic at all, or authoritarian in nature. Now, I'd like to be able to explain the variation in that interesting dependent variable. So as a possible independent variable, we can think about just how wealthy these countries are, and one measure of wealth is gross domestic product per capita. Gross domestic product per capita is the amount of goods and services that a country produces in a certain period of time. And for our research question here, we'll consider annual GDP per capita, how much a country produces in a year. So the idea is that theoretically speaking, the level of wealth in the country is related to its political regime. As GDP per capita increases as countries become more wealthy, they're also more likely to be democratic. So the level of democracy increases in countries that are wealthier or have higher GDP per capita measures. So now that we've identified dependent and independent variables, and you have done so far in your assignments in this course, we want to be able to look at what's called the literature. So what does this mean? This means that it's likely that other scholars have already published articles relating to your dependent variable. Certainly there are a lot of articles about economic development and democracy, which was what the previous slide was about. Now, sometimes there isn't a very substantial literature. In fact, I just wrote a paper and presented it at the annual meeting of the American Political Science Association in Los Angeles last week. That's the major convention for political scientists in the United States, on Israeli election forecasting. And as far as I can tell in my literature research, my literature review, there's a grand total of one other article that has been written about forecasting Israeli elections. So my literature review will be relatively short. Not all literature reviews are necessarily that short. In fact, that's really unusual. We also want to be able to read and analyze other studies on your topic before we conduct our own research. And why would we want to do that? Well, first of all, it may be that the literature has already answered this question that you're interested in an effective fashion. So we don't want to duplicate and take up time and resources on something that's already been covered. Second reason is that we probably want to be able to identify the strengths and weaknesses of the literature and be able to place our research within the contours of the existing literature. For instance, it may be that in the case of the economic development and democracy example, that there's a lot of literature on it, but it's relatively old, that it doesn't incorporate the most current measures of democracy and GDP per capita. And that would be a weakness in the literature. We would only know that if we have actually read the literature. So how do we go about reviewing the literature? We can use a lot of resources from the Albertsons Library here on the Boise State campus. There are a number of databases that we can use, such as Google Scholar, to look for what are called peer-reviewed articles. A peer-reviewed article is an article that is examined or vetted by multiple experts before it is published. And to be published, these articles must meet the highest academic standards. So let me discuss this for a moment. In the peer review process, there's what is called a double-blind peer review. The editor receives manuscripts from scholars who wish to publish in a particular journal. The editor then assigns, after reading the manuscript and deems it well enough to consider for publication, assigns that manuscript to different reviewers, usually 3 or 4. The editor will strip out all identifying information from the manuscript so that the reviewers don't know the author of the manuscript directly. They might be able to guess, especially if it's a relatively small subfield, but they still don't know for sure who wrote the manuscript. The reviewers then go through the manuscript with a fine-tooth comb, look for the strengths and weaknesses within the manuscript, and write a report. That report gets sent back to the editor, who then takes any identifying information of the reviewer from the reviews and sends those reviews back to the author with a decision about the manuscript. And the decisions are one of 3. Either reject the manuscript and say it's just not of high enough quality for my journal, and we will not consider it further. We could revise and resubmit the manuscript, take into account all the reviewer's suggestions, address them, and resubmit the manuscript for possible publication, whereupon it would undergo another review process. There's no assurance that a manuscript, even if it goes through what is called R&R for revise and resubmit status, will necessarily be published by that journal. But there's certainly a chance that it could be published if it meets the highest standards. And the third possible decision is just to simply accept an article on the spot. But I've had experiences all across the board. I've had manuscripts rejected. I've had them under revise and resubmit. Sometimes major revise and resubmit. Sometimes minor things were needed. And a couple of times I've had articles accepted on the spot. So I've been pretty lucky in terms of my publication. Here's some examples of peer-reviewed journals that are key in political science. The American Political Science Review is published by the American Political Science Association, and it is a very prestigious journal. The American Journal of Political Science is published by the Midwestern Political Science Association. It's an example of a very important regional journal in American political science. Legislative Studies Quarterly is founded at the University of Iowa, my alma mater, and accepts manuscripts on legislative behavior, either the institutions themselves or the individuals, the legislators who are populating them. Public Opinion Quarterly is, as you could guess, a journal that is devoted to public opinion polling, analyzing issues about that from an academic perspective. The Journal of Conflict Resolution is an international relations journal that publishes manuscripts on the absence or presence of war, international war, civil war, and also peacekeeping and peace-building types of operations. There are also some important non-peer-reviewed places where we could gather information about our topic. Social media sites will tend to retweet or share papers or blog posts of a research topic that we might be interested in. Print and online news articles are also a potential source, especially If these are digital media that are very prestigious, like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and some TV news sites as well. BBC in particular is a good media source for information. So we really want to check the journal's website to verify whether or not it's a peer-reviewed status. And certainly the American Political Science Review fits that bill. It accepts journals from all across the subfields in political science, political theory, American politics, public policy, public administration, comparative politics, and international relations. And it's published continuously since 1906. So it's one of the oldest journals on political science. It accepts about 10% of the articles that are submitted to it. So it's very hard to be published in it. I've been fortunate to be published in the American Political Science Review. And on our political science faculty, Professors Allen also received a publication, and Professor Wampler has also been published in the APSR. Now, the articles you review should use the same dependent variable as the one that you're focusing on in your project. So if you're interested in studying democracy, you don't want to look at papers that necessarily look at the behavior of the legislature. That might be some aspect of democratic performance, but it's not directly related to democracy. If you instead focus in your literature review on legislative behavior, then you're off the mark. And you probably wasted some time on your end in trying to review these particular pieces when they're not directly related to democracy. So you want to focus on articles that deal with the same dependent variable that you're interested in. They don't have to use the same independent variables. In fact, that might be a point of departure for your project. You might have a unique and new independent variable that you might want to look at. For instance, you may have the most current GDP per capita data, where the literature does not. So that might be a way for you to contribute to the literature by analyzing the most recent GDP per capita data if you're interested in studying its effect on levels of democracy. So let's look briefly at how academic articles are structured. There's first an introductory section, which summarizes what is it that I am discovering in my article. What is it that I would like for you to know in terms of a conclusion about my analysis? So this is the study's unique findings. And in particular, we want to be able to demonstrate how the independent variable affects the dependent variable. We want to be clear in the introduction because most people, when they skim through articles, look closely at the introduction and decide whether or not they want to read it further. So if you're clear there, you might be able to get the reader's interest to read the rest of the article. The literature review, which we've been discussing, summarizes previous research on the project. And if we do the literature review correctly, we're able to show how the literature looks at the way the independent variable we're interested in affects the dependent variable. We should be able to summarize all of that stuff up to date. That's what a good literature review can do. Then there's a theory section where you can, if you're proposing a completely unique independent variable, you could introduce it and then show how it affects the dependent variable. You could also explain how and why the independent variable impacts the dependent variable at this point, which means you'll be involved in hypothesis testing. So you could have multiple new independent variables in this theory section. But there has to be some connection, some clear way in which your independent variable is affecting the dependent variable. Then we also want to be able to, in the paper, the fourth step, show how we collected the data. Where is our data coming from? Is it coming from an original data set? Is it coming from a data set that's already been published? So we want to direct the reader. The author wants to direct the reader to where the data come from, in case the reader wishes to duplicate or replicate this study. And we also, in this fourth section, want to discuss the findings of our data analysis. And we really haven't learned data analytic techniques yet, but we would use a technique on the data and test hypotheses about the theory that we're proposing, linking the independent variable to the dependent variable. Then in a conclusion section, we summarize our findings as the author, and we discuss the extensions of our study. If we're focusing on non-democratic regimes, we want to extend it to semi-democratic regimes, for instance. We're going to propose how our study fits into the future prospects of our literature. So these are generally how articles are structured. They don't have to be precisely in this order. Sometimes they're given different names. Sometimes it's called analytics. Sometimes it's called data. The different sections may have different names associated with them. But in general, you start with the introduction, you end with the conclusion, and you want to introduce the literature and theory before you do the research analysis and discuss data collection. I'm going to bring this podcast to a close, and then with the next podcast, we're going to look at how we actually look at a specific piece of literature.